Let Our People Go, The Medical Case for Reopening Society, by Jeremiah Harding, May 1st, 2020. The apocalypse is still afoot. That oil war I told you about in this article has suddenly become less relevant as the stockpiles of oil max out and the price of oil tanks due to this completely unnecessary lockdown I wrote about over here. For those of you who actually read that article, congratulations! You're one of the very few people who decided to actually give it a fair shake, rather than dismissing it out of hand like hundreds of people already have when myself or others sent it to them. Thanks for being open to the truth, because so many people aren't these days, and that mentality will be the death of many innocent people. Paramount in that conclusion is the fact that while people are in a situation such as this, they seek authoritarian means to solve the problem. This results in an extreme display of the violence inherent in the system. Too many people are too pacified to this totalitarian fascism that is being disguised as a health emergency. While they lounge on the couch, absorbing an insane and unhealthy amount of contact-free deliveries and abusing the postal system with a bunch of unnecessary items shipped to their door to make them more comfortable in their cells, the state is building something nefarious to deploy after this virus is over. Again, if you haven't yet, consider reading that article to understand the panopticon that is being built. Since then, there have been multiple measures in many places to increase the state's access to facial recognition technology. Given the fact that the ID system I discussed in the other article had directly to do with facial recognition, this comes to me as no surprise. Also, since then, there have been many articles and admissions that have come out about the way the state has handled the situation, not the least of which are the CDC coaching guidelines telling medical professionals to list the cause of death as the virus rather than anything else, even when comorbid conditions existed. That, combined with the fact that the state has designated certain hospitals strictly for use in combating this virus, means that a bunch of medical professionals can't do their normal jobs of healing people from much more prevalent, much more normal conditions, which are now deadly because they cannot be treated in a normal way. This leads to an artificially high number of people dying at all, and given the spread rate of the virus, the fact that many deaths are happening and many deaths are being reported as this virus rather than anything else, means that a lot of those unnecessary deaths from normally treatable diseases might in fact just be those diseases. This potentially heightens the fatality rate artificially, so the state and its goons can continue pumping more and more fear porn onto all of the mainstream media outlets, justifying statist overreaches and the continued jailing of the world. But you're supposed to ignore all that, and you're supposed to repeat the statist mantras of social distancing, hand-washing, and a host of other things they have drilled into your mind over the course of this emergency. Just shelter in place, duck and cover, and wait for it all to blow over, ignoring anyone who has anything to say that appears to challenge official narratives. Especially make sure to ignore the fact that the author of the United States Convention on Bioweapons, authored under Bush Sr., claims this was a bioweapon taken from a biosafety level 4 lab and not at all directly related to a wet market in Wuhan. Ignore all the money coming from technocrats like Bill Gates and the fact that the Rockefeller Foundation is yet again in the picture. Ignore all the money that's actively being made from this and the fact that the primary benefactors of the so-called stimulus, designed to help the average American, is corporations and corporate allies. The fact that many poor people haven't seen a dime, myself included, while the IRS has shuttered their offices and blocked their phone lines, means the common person can't even get a hold of them to figure out how to survive the next couple months. The government cares about you, and anyone who disagrees with that is a lousy, no-good conspiracy theorist who should be ashamed of themselves, and who the common person probably hopes dies of this virus. And why do I say this? Well, because I've been watching a lot of people who have issues with people like me calling into question the official narrative, celebrating it when we get the virus, and celebrating even more when we die. There have been many headlines and many articles written about people who criticize the response suddenly coming down with the condition and, quote, getting what's coming to them. No, All of my conspiracy theories are based 100% in fact, so I'm not going to say that I have proof of this, but it is an interesting coincidence that some of the most vocal critics suddenly have the deadly disease. Even if it's not planned that they get it or that they die, it's an interesting test of the scarlet letter being placed on people who have suspicion anyway. We now get to see the gaping maw of the beast open wide as society eats its own at the altar of health and public safety. Take the case of John W. McDaniel, noted Facebook skeptic of the virus and of the response to the virus, who tested positive for the virus not too long after a post went viral where he criticized it. He called the virus a political ploy and criticized the response from the government as overbearing, claiming rightly so that the government does not have the authority under the Constitution to do what they're doing. Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey basically admitted what all these tyrants were thinking too. When discussing peaceful churchgoers ticketed and arrested, he said plainly, quote, "We weren't thinking about the Bill of Rights when we did this." End quote. Oh, really? Nobody could tell. Sarcasm aside, piecing that together on one's own is clearly verboten, given the strict condemnation given McDaniel, who's a cancer survivor of many years, with an already compromised immune system at 60 years old, who was diagnosed and died not too long later. None of the articles trying to point out the irony can find a death certificate, but if they did, I wonder how many comorbid conditions this senior had. None of that matters to the howling media jackals circling the fresh meat of his cooling corpse. They just wanted the headline and a shocking object lesson, or cautionary tale, or some other such garbage to keep people satisfied, being caged in their homes. So, how are these deaths reported normally? Let's ask the Center for Disease Control, who, when distributing coaching materials to doctors on how to report coronavirus deaths, circulated as, quote, vital statistics reporting guidance, end quote, in a document entitled, quote, Guidance for Certifying Deaths Due to Coronavirus Disease 2019, in April 2020, said the following. If COVID-19 played a role in the death, this condition should be specified on the death certificate. In many cases, it's likely that it will be used in the OCOD as it can lead to various life-threatening conditions such as pneumonia and acute respiratory distress syndrome. In these cases, COVID-19 should be reported on the lowest line used in Part 1 with the other conditions to which it gave rise listed on the lines above it. Generally, it's best to avoid abbreviations and acronyms, but COVID-19 is unambiguous, so it's acceptable to report on the death certificate. In some cases, survival from COVID-19 can be complicated by pre-existing chronic conditions, especially those that result in diminished lung capacity, such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or asthma. These medical conditions do not cause COVID-19, but can increase the risk of contracting a respiratory infection and death, so these conditions should be reported in Part 2 and not in Part 1. So there you have it. The CDC is demanding that all deaths even related to coronavirus can be counted as primarily coronavirus-caused deaths. Now, when many people, myself included, brought this up to a decent chunk of people and kept spreading the word about this obvious biasing of statistics, our lack of medical experience and or training was used to impugn our character and fallaciously call into question our entire point, and any sort of questioning of the official narrative surrounding this virus. But we're not just lone, crazed conspiracy theorists. There are plenty of people in medicine who understand the same issue to be true. Doctor and Senator Scott Jensen told Minnesota's Valley News Live that he and many docs were sent that document, explaining that both its wording and use will be used to crank up the numbers even when no testing at all was done. Quote, I worry about that sometimes. We're so darn interested in jazzing up the fear factor that sometimes people's ability to think for themselves is paralyzed if they're frightened enough. End quote. One of the scenarios listed under the CDC guidance for certifying deaths due to coronavirus says that although no testing was done, the coroner determined that the likely underlying cause of death was COVID-19, given the patient's symptoms and exposure to an infected individual. So, is the Minnesota state data reliable? Quote, I don't have any position to question that, said Dr. Jensen. I know that I've talked with nursing staff who've been involved with people who have passed away that either had living wills or were on hospice care, and in some of those situations, I've been led to believe that there may have been a COVID-19 diagnosis included on the death certificate document without having had a COVID-19 confirmed laboratory test. End quote. Highlighted on the screen in their report was the following quote from the document, in a section with an example of how reporting is being ordered to be done, including a sample of a filled-out death certificate. Quote, "In this case, the acute respiratory acidosis was the immediate cause of death, so it was reported on line A. Acute respiratory acidosis was precipitated by the COVID-19 infection, which was reported below it on line B. In part 1, the COPD and hypertension were contributing causes but were not a part of the causal sequence in part 1, so those conditions were reported in part 2. End quote. This seems to be confirmed by the previous alert document from the CDC. Quote, "If the death certificate reports terms such as probable COVID-19 or likely COVID-19, these terms would be assigned the new ICD code. It is not likely that NCHS will follow up on these cases. If pending COVID-19 testing is reported on the death certificate, this would be considered a pending record. In this scenario, NCHS would expect to receive an updated record since the code will likely result in R99. In this case, NCHS will ask the states to follow up to verify if test results confirm that the decedent had COVID-19. End quote. So this seems to confirm its suspicions. If you aren't sure, call it COVID. We'll sort it out later. Maybe. With samples already taken or new ones taken from a corpse. We'll be honest, we promise. And Jensen, in another interview for VNL, he also said, quote, "As a physician, I received an email last week from the Department of Health coaching me on how to fill out death certificates, and I've never really received coaching from the Vital Statistics Agency in terms of how to do a death certificate before. Basically, I felt like they were saying, you know, you don't have to have a confirmed laboratory test for COVID-19 in order to make the death certificate be COVID-19. End quote. Fortunately, he got word out and wasn't silenced. Doctors around the world are being told to keep their mouths shut about their viewpoints if they seem alternative, or even make a hospital they happen to work for look bad. I can't tell you how many people I know in medicine have come to me directly about this, but who wish to remain anonymous. I also can't tell you the accounts of the people I know who've been treated for coronavirus because they've been told to keep it silent as well, but because of my writing style and my devotion to journalistic integrity and credibility, I can't talk about that since it's not corroborated. It also doesn't help that I've been mocking people for spreading unsubstantiated, baseless rumors about various things surrounding this virus, and honestly, about many other things throughout my history, but what I can tell you is that there are many corroborated sources of information in this regard, and I can also tell you that it doesn't even have to be particularly egregious an offense in order to draw the ire of the medical establishment. Take the case of this Indiana physician who dared to put out the call for additional N95 respirators on a forum only to be silenced by the hospital they work for making them look bad. From Medscape, physicians silenced. Quote, "A hospitalist in Indiana took to social media to plead for donations of N95 masks, hoping to help local hospitals prepare for the pandemic to reach them. Shortly afterward, administrators from his hospital contacted the online forum's moderator and the posts were removed," he told MDEG News. Administrators also warned him not to post about personal protective equipment because it made the hospital appear incompetent and continued to monitor his social media posts. Quote, "I was told, 'We can handle this. We don't need the public's help,' the physician said. I was hurt and upset. I was trying to help and protect my peers." End quote. Clinicians across the country are being told not to speak to the media and not to post on social media about their experiences. Quote, "There's definitely a big fear among physicians, particularly employed physicians, in terms of what the consequences may be for telling their stories," end quote, said one physician advocate. End quote. But this reporting bias was enough to get Billy Hayes of #DebunkThisFauci looking at some numbers. He noticed this trend where the CDC numbers would all be associated with the same ICD code that seems to completely confirm the hypothesis. Most of these alleged COVID deaths are simply assumptive in nature, meaning the entire reporting statistics are biased in favor of an agenda which would engender fear. He has an entire YouTube channel now dedicated to looking more critically at these numbers and analyzing them. And he's not alone in his criticism of the reported numbers, nor are questions as to these numbers relegated to fringe YouTube channels dedicated to conspiracies. A respiratory therapist blew the whistle on the fact that his hospital not only did not have a shortage of ventilators, but they had an overabundance of them, and he also went into some detail about the fact that already unhealthy people in higher risk groups who may have had pre-existing conditions that were much worse than the actual virus, or who may have had an already life-threatening condition prior to admission, were still being qualified as COVID deaths. From his video, censored on YouTube, mirrored to BitChute, quote, "I want to talk about the numbers and the criteria that goes into what a COVID patient is, or a patient under investigation, what's also called a PUI. Basically, right now, and the way it has been the last couple months when they locked us down, is that any patient that came in with a respiratory problem was labeled COVID. Now, that doesn't matter if you got stage 4 lung cancer, pancreatitis, heart disease, liver failure, and everything else. You're still, because you come in with a breathing problem, labeled a COVID patient. Now we have one lady that could do the testing at first that would go, those tests went to the CDC. Only one person was qualified to test for the whole place. So several of these patients under investigations were never tested, and maybe they died or whatever. Then they would die of COVID and not of stage 4 lung cancer or these things." End quote. He went on to say that he foresees a spike in COVID cases with a dramatic drop in actual deaths if they actually ever do start to do in-house testing, which he claims is starting to ramp up. Additionally, he called into question the nature of these tests, looking at the fact that the tests that were currently available were not directly tests for COVID, but tests for RNA as a result of damage. He also questioned the nature of the ventilator production boom, questioning the fact that most of the people producing these ventilators are entrenched corporations with profit motives, and the existing institutions producing ventilators are already producing enough of them because clearly his hospital has a surplus. Quote, "If you cannot use the non-invasive ventilation and have to go straight to the ventilator, that creates a ventilator shortage. But you also want to ask why it's Ford and GM in the business of making ventilators when we have plenty of companies that already make ventilators." End quote. Strange indeed. Almost like a significant amount of the response to this virus is the old thing of not allowing a good crisis to go to waste, and all these corporations which needed a little bit of a boost in profits got the ability to exploit government funding and contracts in order to benefit from a situation that happens to be killing a whole lot of innocent people. Almost. For legal reasons, that's a joke. Nobody in wartime conditions has ever done anything similar to what I just described, and we're absolutely not in a wartime condition issued by a federal government and parroted by mainstream media, state governments, and governments all around the world. And while that's absolutely not happening, a bunch of infrastructure isn't being built to control us better under the guise of being more hygienic and better capable of tracking us in terms of vaccines. I mean, if any of that was happening, it would be practically tantamount to fascism, and we all know that can't happen here because we killed the only type of fascism that was ever even possible. That's what World War II was, and it can never happen again, certainly not in the perfect country of America. It would be a terrible thing for me to say anything similar to that, and would make me a kooky conspiracy theorist, and we can't have that. And that's just a doc with concerns about the raw numbers. Dan Erickson and Artin Matsihi, two doctors with a lot of experience, criticized the shelter-in-place orders and were met with a hefty lot of criticism. Now, to preface this particular paragraph, I feel the need to say that there is some reasonable criticism about the information they provided in their briefing. However, this criticism is normally leveled at the extrapolation comments, which don't actually account for the majority of what was said. For the purposes of this article, I will not be referencing directly the numbers that they cite, rather their criticism of the lockdown in general as a response to numbers at all. As they say, they have had, quote, extensive classes in microbiology, biochemistry, and immunology, and have, quote, studied this each of us for 20 years. So I think it's unwise to discount literally everything that they said in this hour-long presentation simply because of a minor disagreement about the phrasing related to certain figures cited in the report. Specifically, I want to highlight comments that they made about the immune system response to lockdown, and the fact that this current response from the government flies in the face of a long history of immunology studies claiming that not being outside and regularly in contact with pathogens, over sanitizing everything, and creating superbugs is a mistake. Quote, I want to talk about the immune system. We both had years of microbiology, biochemistry, and biology studies. We've made it our life's work to understand this stuff, and I'd like to go over some basic things about how the immune system functions so people have a good understanding. The immune system is built by exposure to antigens, viruses, and bacteria. When you're a little child crawling on the ground, putting stuff in your mouth, viruses and bacteria come in. You form an antigen-antibody complex. You form IgG, IgM. This is how your immune system is built. You don't take a small child, put them in bubble wrap in a room, and say, go have a healthy immune system. This is immunology and microbiology 101. This is the basis of what we've known for years. End quote. Immunoglobulin G, or IgG, is the most common antibody found in blood and other fluids to protect you from viruses and bacteria. Immunoglobulin M is the first response antibody found in blood and lymph tissue. Info on these, as well as other antibodies, can be found here. He continues, quote, what I'm seeing is, when you take human beings and you say, go into your house, clean all your counters, Lysol them down, you're going to kill 99% of viruses and bacteria, wear a mask, don't go outside, what it does to our immune system is used to touching. We share bacteria. We develop an immune response daily to this stuff. When you take that away from me, my immune system drops. As I shelter in place, my immune system drops. You keep me there for months, it drops more, and now I'm at home, vigorously washing the counters, worried about things that are indeed what I need to survive. Let's follow the science. This is immunology, folks. This is microbiology. End quote. He also mentions in another interview over a month ago that employers are specifically sending their employees to his clinic to get tested if they're concerned. They say, quote, if you're a person of concern from their perspective, they send them here for screening. We're working with the employers that make sure they get a negative screen so they can go back to work. It's the same 5 criteria we've been mentioning. It's fever, it's cough, it's shortness of breath. Have you been exposed to someone with COVID-19? Have you been traveling to areas where there's a lot of cases? End quote. Because of this, and because he had some of the most comprehensive data on this subject, given the fact that he had been absorbing a lot of these cases for Kern County and California, the media reached out to him to do that briefing. Since it's come out, he's been raked over the coals, disavowed by a significant portion of the medical community. It's become the target of a censorship campaign, constantly pulling the video off YouTube, suspending channels which re-upload it, and more, all while screeching a pack of jackals demands that his medical license be revoked for daring to go adjacent to the mainstream narrative rather than completely in accordance with it. When asked during a Fox News interview about his experience, he had this to say, quote, the press has asked me, we know you're doing a lot of testing. Can you please let us know what your results are? I live in Kern County, 900,000 people, and there's 3 basic networks. I said, why don't we get together and I'll just tell you my total tests and my positives, which I did. At the time, it was 5,200 tests and about 340 positives. Currently, it's about 6,000 tests with 413 positives. So I said, this is our raw data. This isn't a biostatistical analysis, but they had been asking me, since you're doing most of the testing in Kern County, can you please give us an update? So I wasn't really giving detailed, clinically controlled data that was biostatistically analyzed. I was giving raw data because the community had asked me, what is your data? End quote. He concluded by way of citing the chief epidemiologist in Sweden, where an experiment is being conducted as to whether or not shelter-in-place and social distancing is even necessary for the entire population, as saying the virus is going to run its course, and every country will likely have similar numbers when it's over whether or not they sheltered in place. He also mentions the existence of empty hospitals and a whole lot of doctors being furloughed, with entire wings and wards shut down in order to accommodate the new restrictions on healthcare surrounding the coronavirus, and the overall panic incited by these measures that prevents the common person from wanting to go in for fear of catching the virus, and thus falling much more gravely ill to existing preventable conditions due to lack of treatment. Even Newsweek is covering this topic, normally an outlet relegated to mocking anything approaching this kind of issue as a conspiracy theory, as though that actually argues against any points in a conspiracy theory, but I digress, and had this to say, quote, "Tens of thousands of healthcare workers across the U.S. are going without pay today, even as providers in the nation's hotspots struggle to contain the coronavirus pandemic. This tale of two hospitals is a function of clumsy, if well-intentioned, federal and state directives to halt all non-emergency procedures, which appeared at first blush to be a reasonable precaution to limit unnecessary exposure and safeguard staff, beds, and equipment. But instead of merely preserving hospital beds and other resources, this heavy-handed injunction has created a burden of its own design, a historic number of empty beds and systems left untouched by the pandemic. Those hospitals have resorted to unprecedented levels of furloughs to stave off temporary budget shortfalls, but industry and economic trends point to more lasting outcomes unless immediate action is taken." They continue, "It does not take an economist to understand the underlying economics here, and it won't just be rural healthcare that will suffer. Hospitals in every corner of the country might close for good. The coronavirus will continue to spread throughout the U.S., but our ability to treat and prevent its transmission will be severely constrained if, as yet unaffected hospitals resort to mass layoffs. We need to sustain robust staffing in every corner of the country, and prohibiting elective surgeries outright is wildly counterproductive." End quote. In an interview from my YouTube channel, a doctor with many years of experience agreed with that, saying, quote, "A friend's a surgical tech, and she hasn't been working for weeks because she does elective surgery. Only, I've got friends that are nurses, and even in the ERs, a lot of them are being furloughed. The whole situation's ridiculous." End quote. But, maybe that's why so many have so much time to party and mess around, and why so many videos have been released about them being bored in largely empty hospitals, because they simply aren't allowed to work what they would normally work, and they're waiting to be furloughed just like other doctors and hung out to dry just like the rest of us with this crippled economy. And speaking of the crippled economy, let's just take a brief moment to mention all the farmers, ranchers, and other people involved in our food production who have had to shut down because meat packing plants are forced to stop operating since their employees have to be close to each other in order to do their jobs. Let's talk about people in production of material goods other than food who are forced to leave the employment they need to eat, and also at the same time shut down supply chains domestically. Both of these things drive people into the big corporations who are still for some reason allowed to operate and away from small businesses, thus driving the production that would have been allotted to those small businesses overseas. This means that we're getting more imports from potentially unquarantined countries and more people isolated in the same areas, like grocery megastores, which is somehow okay, while churches are being raided. Sound counterproductive? Wait till you hear this. There have been many reports similar to the ones that have come out over oil, where certain people just have to start destroying their stock because there's no more room for it in their storage and nobody's processing it. Not only that, but plenty of politicians are complicit in government orders to slaughter cattle, destroy food, pour out liquid beverages and foodstuffs, and let it all rot. This is rather than giving it to the needy, of which there are a staggeringly huge amount now, flooding the food banks to overcapacity, rather than selling it directly to consumers, or allowing meat packing and other food packaging plants to reopen so that these places can start to sell stock back to who they used to sell it to. Governments around the world effectively criminalize production upon which their economies rely, forcing them to rely on expensive government bailouts rather than the labor that many people want to get back to. This situation has become so staggering that the UN is now claiming that an equivalent of 195 million jobs will be wiped out globally, in addition to 6.7% of working hours to be destroyed in the second quarter. This, along with looming fears of an upcoming food shortage, has a lot of people up in arms, I would say understandably. This has led to a ton of protests, not the least of which were protests blocking traffic to remind the governments of whatever country they were in exactly who they rely on to function, being the common person, not some detached bureaucrat or his well-paid billionaire funder. These protests have almost universally led to calls for more government, with certain crowds even calling for everybody involved to be tracked and have certain rights taken away. Additionally, peaceful people on their own have been arrested as though they were contaminating huge swaths of land or were an inherent threat to whatever area they were in. One absurd example of which is skateboarders operating a skate park, which was later filled in with sand, or a paddleboarder arrested for social distancing in the middle of an open beach rather than sheltering in place at his government-assigned cell that they also call a home. Couples who share a bed have been separated in public and threatened with fines and tickets if they didn't separate in public, in contravention of basic human needs and love. We're being forced to be more and more distant from one another and more reliant on the government. I wonder who would want that to be the new paradigm. It truly boggles the mind. And perhaps the most amusing part of all of this is the politicians, police officers, pundits, and others constantly disrespecting social distancing and good hygiene, in contravention of everything they're telling us to do. It's as though they're part of an immortal class of super beings who can't be infected by this virus. Hey, it's not like there was a White House press conference where something like, quote, "You can take off your masks. The case fatality rates at 0.1 to 0.3 and everybody here has been vaccinated anyway," was said. That sounds too much like a conspiracy theory to be true, because we all know that nobody ever conspires in any way at all, ever. And while we're totally not talking about any conspiracies, let's also not entertain the idea that this might have a motive, like a profit motive. Like, maybe there's an article floating around that talks about how America's super rich have seen their wealth rise $282 billion in 3 weeks of the pandemic. It also mentions the fact that one of these billionaires happens to donate over $9 million to The Guardian, over $3 million to NBC Universal, over $4.5 million to NPR, $1 million to Al Jazeera, and $49 million to the BBC Media Action Program because, as we all know, the corporate media has a great reputation for sourcing and fact-checking all claims rather than simply parroting what they heard. Serving a biased agenda which might help their bottom line and assists them in the securing of ads, there's literally no possible way that a billionaire with interest in the field of technology and vaccine research would possibly buy the positive media coverage for their new approach to a virus that just came out. There's no way that these media outlets could be serving an agenda like that and therefore be financially incentivized to discredit any and all coverage that goes against their particular narrative. So there's obviously absolutely no chance that these media organizations are pushing the same stories, or making anyone who seems a little bit critical of them seem like the outsiders. Could be setting the entire agenda up by proxy through a media cycle that basically believes anyone who seems official enough. That isn't happening, and if you think anything else, you're a paranoid conspiracy theorist who should be relegated to the dustbin of history. So, what is all of this statism doing? People are being beaten, dragged through the streets, pulled off buses, gassed, arrested, tased, and more to be forced to stay in their homes in contravention of decades of immunological research, creating superbugs by hyper-sanitizing everything. For any of you who actually read my massive article I already wrote for this site, I went over the fact that this virus is being used as a pretext for a massive global superstate reliant on a contact-free control grid based on biometric data collected in conjunction with the vaccination process. This, in association with a brand new digital dollar as economic times transfer wealth from the lowest classes to the highest and destroy even more any illusion that this country had a middle class, is just as effective for social control as China's because it's almost exactly like it. The cultish mantra being recited over and over of what the new normal will look like, inducing us all into a future that would make Orwell, Huxley, and all other authors of dystopian fiction blush, does little to cover up the authentic discussion of whether or not the old normal was obsolete. Why are we suddenly throwing out so many decades of epidemiological research in order to come to the conclusions that bubble wrapping your existence is the way to preserve a strong immune system? And is there a better way? Here at Agorist Nexus, there is a diversity of perspectives and approaches. Not everyone is as dark, insane, and negative as I am, but one thing that we all have in common is we believe the black and gray market is an effective solution to tightly controlled times such as these. We would definitely appreciate the ability to work in the economy no matter what any government organization says. There's an old saying among our types, quote, "Let the black and gray markets choke the state." If you want freedom, there's a potential you'll have to actually stand for it, regardless of what officials tell you, and regardless of how much society would rather you simply obey those officials. If they put this massive tracking system in place and demand that you be vaccinated in order to travel, participate in the economy, or even exit your house, you might have to set up a gray economy of artificial documents. If they won't let you congregate, you might have to just do it anyway and understand the potential resistance that might occur to your action. Freedom might be dangerous again, and there might be a little watering needed to do on some tree somewhere. But the general point is that the lockdown is over if you want it to be. I can't tell you how many thousands of people I talk to who want it to be over and who want to get back to the old normal at least, many of whom are starting to see things in a more anarchic way because of all of this. Yes, the economy should be reopened, and no, that does not mean I hate old people. But let's be extremely clear that the majority of the people who are dying are at-risk categories for all other illnesses, and that compounded with an unhealthy life they chose to lead while falsely believing that the system would be there for a safety net no matter who footed the bill. This is not a new condition in terms of the affected people primarily being unhealthy, old, and newly born people. That has been the condition for a very long time and will always be the condition, especially in a fundamentally unhealthy society like the US, where somebody like Bill Maher can catch flack for telling people to stop overeating. This society is gorged on grain, binged on TV, and otherwise disconnected from the effects of their actions to the point of being so massively unhealthy that we're the laughing stock of the world. The fact is that the US is at the head of the global hegemony table, which means that many other nations have followed suit, leading bands like Rammstein to make songs like America, bemoaning the loss of culture and the homogenization of globalized capitalism. The primary dead people in China were old male smokers, and the primary considered condition that led to their susceptibility for the virus over women was the fact that they smoked most of their lives. And numbers are being fudged all over the world, the United States included, in order to claim that the existing comorbid conditions which would have been there for a long time, like the cancer survivor I mentioned earlier. People have intentionally chosen to live unhealthy lifestyles, and it's led to a long history of the US being a hotbed for a long series of illnesses, and this is just the top card in the deck. The average US citizen is all too happy to allow the government to be their primary so-called solution when any of these situations start to happen, leading to an influx of statism wherever these sorts of problems occur. Born and raised in conditions that teach them that the US government is the only solution to these problems, they assume that anybody who says the government shouldn't be solving these problems says that these problems shouldn't be solved. This is why anarchists are constantly beset by statists with questions as to who would pay for what. This is a silent confession on the part of the person saying it that they only pay for things because they're forced to, and wouldn't if they weren't. It shows that they're happy to force people to pay for what they themselves would not voluntarily fund, but I know many people reading this, even if they got this far and became some of the few people who have actually entertained what I've said rather than dismissing it outright, will probably still think I'm insane, and rightly so. My internet presence isn't exactly the most civil way of looking at things, so why don't we go into one of the last bastions of anarchist purism, a shining beacon on a hill in the midst of a statist hellscape? Real Time with Bill Maher and the New York Times. Now, I know what you're thinking. No way do those people agree with this nutcase, and you'd be right, for the most part. But Bill had on a doctor who had an extremely good job of explaining the case, both here and in a New York Times op-ed, in that this pandemic should not be universally handled the same way, and that treating the rest of the world like New York City is the wrong and non-scientific response. Let's start with the op-ed, written by Yale Griffin Prevention Research Center's Dr. David Katz. Quote, "The data from South Korea, where tracking the coronavirus has been by far the best to date, indicate that as much as 99% of active cases in the general population are mild and do not require specific medical treatment. The small percentage of cases that do require such services are highly concentrated among those age 60 and older, and further so the older people are. Other things being equal, those over age 70 appear at 3 times the mortality risk as those age 60 to 69, and those over age 80 at nearly twice the mortality risk of those aged 70 to 79. These conclusions are corroborated by the data from Wuhan, China, which show a higher death rate, but an almost identical distribution. The higher death rate in China may be real, but is perhaps a result of less widespread testing. South Korea promptly and uniquely started testing the apparently healthy population at large, finding the mild and asymptomatic cases of COVID-19 other countries are overlooking. He continues, I am deeply concerned that the social, economic, and public health consequences of this near-total meltdown of normal life, schools and businesses closed, gatherings banned, will be long-lasting and calamitous, possibly graver than the direct toll of the virus itself. The stock market will bounce back in time, but many businesses never will. The unemployment, impoverishment, and despair likely to result will be public health scourges of the first order. Worse, I fear our efforts will do little to contain the virus because we have a resource-constrained, fragmented, perennially underfunded public health system. Distributing such limited resources so widely, so shallowly, and so haphazardly is a formula for failure. How certain are you of the best ways to protect your most vulnerable loved ones? How readily can you get tested? If we succeed in slowing the spread of coronavirus from torrent to trickle, then when does the society-wide disruption end? When will it be safe for healthy children and younger teachers to return to school, much less older teachers and teachers with chronic illnesses? When will it be safe for the workforce to repopulate the workplace, given that some are in the at-risk group for severe infection? When would it be safe to visit loved ones in nursing homes or hospitals? When once again might grandparents pick up their grandchildren? End quote. And what's his advice? Basically, at-risk groups stay home. If you're relatively healthy, proceed with life as normal, trying to care as much as possible for those who can't care for themselves on a community level. He favors proactive rather than reactive testing and advocates for the actual definition of quarantine, which is not to detain everyone but to detain only those who are critically ill. You know, the thing that people like me have been advocating for many months now. To be fair, he wrote this op-ed a month ago. He was ahead of the curve in terms of doctors finally starting to speak some sense on the issue. But his interview on Real Time was on April 24th. So has anything major changed since then that made him stop saying the same reasonable stuff he was saying a month ago? Did he get any Bill Gates money to start hushing up about the more measured and reasonable approach? No. And Bill Maher was all too happy to have this breath of fresh air talk some sense for once. Maher said, some people questioned your op-ed that was in the New York Times about a month ago. It was called, Is Our Fight Against Coronavirus Worse Than the Disease? I think it's good someone's at least asking that question. We can't just lapse into groupthink. Let me quote the thing you said recently that I think is the most interesting and gets at this point. You said, if all we do is flatten the curve, you don't prevent deaths, you just change the dates. Cats. That's taken directly from some of the world-class risk modelers that I've been working with. Some of these risk models basically show essentially what's flattening the curve does is keep people away from one another and away from the virus so the virus doesn't spread, but you also don't cultivate any immunity. The minute you release those clamps and let people back into the world, we're all vulnerable. So most of the models suggest that flattening the curve makes sense in phase 1, so you don't overwhelm medical systems, for example, but you've got to have a phase 2. If you don't transition to a phase 2 whenever you release the clamps, the virus is out in the world waiting for you. Everyone is vulnerable, and that big peak in cases and that big peak in deaths that you were trying to avoid really just happens at a later date. End quote. He goes on to say that the Swedish approach might not be perfect, but stepping in that direction would be positive. Quote, on the other hand, if you lock everything down, you destroy livelihoods, you destroy jobs. And what I was saying, in what I didn't really think was a controversial article at the beginning, is that there's really more than one way built for this situation to hurt people or even kill them. And all of them are bad, and there's more than one way to protect people and save them, and all of those are good. So the one thing we want to do is keep those vulnerable to severe infection away from this nasty bug, but we don't want to destroy people's lives and livelihoods and means of feeding their families. There's a middle path, and the middle path essentially is high-risk people are protected from exposure, low-risk people go out into the world early. And here's the odd part, Bill. I think that people have a hard time confronting and accepting. We actually kind of want to get this, and get it over with, and be immune. Because that's the path to the all clear. That doesn't require us to wait for a vaccine, which optimistically is 18 months away, but could be much longer. End quote. Yes! This is that. It's also what I've been saying since January. However, I understand not listening to me. I'm a conspiracy theorist, hippie-looking crazy guy primed for his own Netflix documentary. But now somebody official who has a ton of experience, including being on the front lines in New York right now, is saying the same exact thing. This is a person who trained at the Einstein School of Medicine, a person who studied at Yale, and what he's advocating is ostensibly the libertarian solution. Don't look for a one-size-fits-all approach that some centralized entity can blanket over everything to make it feel more secure. Don't look to that force mechanism to solve problems of biology which require a knowledge of medicine in order to fully understand, much less find solutions to. Listen to a wide variety of medical professionals instead of just the ones that the state puts in front of you and tells you to obey. Hell, I wouldn't be able to put this in front of you had I not been a subscriber to Bill Maher's channel. I know I disagree with him on a ton of things, but looking past our differences and trying to find solutions is precisely the core of anarchy. I mean, yeah, it's not necessarily going to make the establishmentarians happy, especially since it's harder to profit off of something if you have a more measured response to it, and also doesn't make you seem like the universal savior of everything sent down from heaven as an angel of light. Hint, hint. And ultimately, part of this is going to be realizing that sometimes things like this happen, and there is no solution, to which force is the core of the answer. These are pathogens. They're invisible microorganisms to which we cannot see, cannot build a fence to keep out, cannot put in a cage, can't do anything of the sort with. It's messy, it's unpleasant, and it's something that we will have to deal with from time to time with the understanding that sometimes life sucks and you can't do anything about it. However, that's not all, and if there's a silver lining to any of this at all, it's the fact that these sorts of situations always change society. Now you can hope that the new normal is a society where everybody is universally tracked in the potential that they are committing the egregious crime of carrying the same pathogens that most people have on them at any point anyway. But I'm good on that. I'm good on enriching billionaires at the expense of the poor, entrapping society in deadlock like this while wealth transfers to them, small businesses are closed, and more people have to rely on the corporate government hierarchy in order to survive. I'm also good in regards to assisting these people in controlling the whole of society and forming a facial recognition superstate because they had an excuse to do what they always wanted to do, and have a better way to manage their tax farm before the inevitable collapse. So what's this silver lining then? It exposes the unhealthy lifestyles upon which we've relied for centuries. The first step in avoiding a trap is knowing of its existence, and now we know of its existence. We see the brutality of a pathogen on people vulnerable to it, largely due to lifestyle choices they could change at any moment, and a society full of people who chose to get arts degrees rather than going into healthcare is almost certainly going to complain about a lack of medical professionals during times of emergency, while not having worked to become part of that solution to begin with. That aside, the primary victim of this virus has been old people with a long history of unhealthy habits, and that doesn't make these deaths any less hard for those who cared for those people. But if those people, and yourself included, want to make it easier on those you love, then start taking better care of yourself, and holding your loved ones accountable to do the same. Get healthy, and stop relying on government to tell you how health works. Listen to a wide variety of health experts and try to find the diet and lifestyle that matches your body and your mind the best. Avoid obviously unhealthy things like intentionally inhaling smoke. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who claim to be clean and sober only to have switched their drugs and alcohol for other drugs and drinks. It's still a drug, even if it's in a form that society accepts enough to put behind a gas station counter. If I see you outside an NA meeting or in a sober living facility breathing in a cigarette, I'm going to silently judge you as a hypocrite. Understand that I never want to be in your position of feeling like you're doing better while exposing yourself to the sorts of problems that will someday burden the rest of the world in this sort of way. Same with sugar and excess unhealthy fat intake. These things have been proven to light up the same areas in rats' brains as cocaine does. And if you think that it's not a drug just because your kid can legally eat it, I'd like to remind you that Bayer used to sell a concoction of cocaine, meth, and heroin as a cough syrup. They were also a business which collaborated with the Nazis in World War II and used the forced labor that the Germans stole from the people they were actively genociding in order to make products there. And some of those Nazis moved to America under paperclip and embedded in our medicine. Funny how quickly people forget that the medical companies we now revere were not too long ago participating in barbarity. This brings my insane rant to a close. In a good way, I think. Because no more like fascism could it be than police forces rounding up anybody who disobeys the government, with a nationalized economy under wartime authorization and troops on the ground, all because a certain group of people decided to behave in a way that was verboten. It's like when you see a TV show that you know you've seen before because it's so much like so many of the others that are out there. You want to turn it off because you think you know what's coming, but you have a morbid curiosity about what's different this time. Now, the mark isn't for the otherized group, it's a tattoo in exchange for acceptance. Now, instead of requiring boots on the ground, constantly marching through cities, there's a national registry, regularly updated with yet more biometric data attached to all of our identities. Meaning all they have to do is send a vehicle out and do a silent raid of whoever they want to, for any reason now, because something to remember is that the government does not contract, it constantly grows, not relinquishing power when it gets it. The powers it gets to deal with this virus will be used to curtail your liberties even once the virus is gone. The same way that all the national authorizations that have happened around the same time as 9/11 and around the same time as $23.2 trillion suddenly went missing, suddenly had a bunch of programs that stuck around even to this day when we haven't really been attacked in nearly as brutal a way since. The Cold War was used as an excuse to bolster a ton of spying powers and authorize the rise of Middle Eastern terror from Operation Cyclone, and it was used to justify things like what would become the main thrust of the NK programs, using some of those pesky Germans I mentioned were paper-clipped in here earlier. World Wars 1 and 2 were used to justify the rise of a global superstate and state control of the economy. The Civil War created the prison-industrial complex. I could go on. I could keep talking about how war is always the health of the state, and always used to expand it, and the fact that this government is using wartime propaganda and language in order to justify their actions should be terrifying to all of us. The government has a long history of exploiting crises to their ends. It has happened here, and it can happen here again, and it is. The question is, are you going to stand for your freedoms, or are you going to duck and cover and shelter in place while they're all stripped from you in broad daylight? Because that's exactly what's happening. So, what are you going to do about it? And are